Hello everyone, welcome back to another video lecture. So today we're taking a look at our second piece on immortality specifically. So this follows up on the Bernard Williams piece we were looking at last time. In fact, if you've taken a look at the Fischer piece, which is what we're looking at today, you'll see that Fischer himself engages directly with Williams, in fact sums up some of what Williams is saying and directly disagrees with Williams. So this pair of pieces forms a pretty nice example of the kind of disagreement, the kind of arguments you can have in philosophy. So Fischer himself is a contemporary American philosopher at the University of California, Riverside. He's worked in a number of areas, but he's most interesting to us for the sake of this course is his work on immortality and the meaning of life. And in fact, he's got a new book from Oxford, just came out this year, Death, Immortality, and the Meaning of Life, which I'm still waiting to get my hands on and read. In fact, Oxford had a little seminar a little while ago where Fischer was talking about the book. It was a virtual seminar held, I think it was early this month in May or in late April. I was actually in that seminar, and there's a video of it somewhere online with me asking Fischer a question. So I don't know if it's really worth digging up, which is why I haven't linked it here or anything. But really, it was just a bit of a open forum where Fischer was really asking some questions that relate directly to this article. So let's just go ahead and jump into the piece itself to see what Fischer has to say. And as you're going to see, like I said, Fischer disagrees with Williams. So last time we saw Williams say, necessarily immortality seems like it would be a bad thing for creatures like us, because eventually you're going to get bored. Your categorical desires are going to be fulfilled, or really they become uninteresting at some point. And so if you stay you over time, really immortality can't be appealing. So really what we should shoot for is to die at the right time. So Fischer really doesn't think that's such a good idea. And this piece of his was an article, and it sums up nicely his basic view on this matter here. So why immortality is not so bad. I think the title really gives it away. Fischer is going to really defend the appeal of at least the potential appeal of immortality, right? So he wants to contend that Williams' thesis that immortality is necessarily a bad thing, that it was always bad to be immortal, isn't right. So the first thing he does is really explains, just in a nutshell, Williams' view and the two criteria that Williams comes up with for an immortal life to be appealing, right? Remember, he's got those two conditions. And then ultimately, Fischer is going to argue against Williams. And he does this by making some important distinctions. So one is between the content and ownership of experiences. This speaks to one part of Williams' case against immortality. And also the claim that Williams sets up unnecessarily high standards for experience. And Fischer distinguishes between different kinds of pleasurable experiences. So Fischer wants to investigate a little bit more carefully what standards Williams is setting, right? And if you remember, Williams says somewhat famously that in an immortal life, boredom would have to be unthinkable for that life to be appealing. Fischer's going to target that. Fischer also distinguishes and tries to sort out different kinds of pleasurable experiences. And he says it's really important to do this because if we just run them all together, it might seem like we can never have the sorts of experiences that would be appealing over the course of an immortal life, and that's really what Williams is banking on. But if we're careful, and if we think about it carefully, we can realize that in fact, an immortal life, at least of a certain sort, one characterized by certain sorts of experiences or activities, itself really could be appealing. It could be a good thing. Okay, so let's take a look at Fischer's engagement with Williams. So he really starts by summarizing Williams, seeing what Bernard Williams has to say on this. And so he identifies these two conditions that Williams has, which Williams himself, in some sense, he kind of names them, but not really. I find it tends to be quite helpful when we give names to things to try to keep them in mind. And Fischer does that here, and I really quite like the way he does it because it makes these conditions fairly easy to remember. So he calls the first one the identity condition, and the way Fischer articulates this: the individual can recognize himself throughout his future. That is, the individual remains someone genuinely identical to the individual. And this was really Williams' first point. If we're really talking about personal immortality, when I look into the future, no matter how far into the future I'm looking, I need to be able to see that it's still me that's there. If over time I've changed into a totally different person, right? Somebody who has different memories and different desires and perhaps a different body and all these sorts of things, at some point it's just not me anymore. And why would I want to live forever if eventually it's not really me, right? So in fact, a good way to think about that, because again, there are these open questions of personal identity. What is it that makes us the same people through time? What is it that makes you the same person now that you were when you were 2 or 5 or 10, right? What is it that's going to make you the same person when you're, 50 or 70 or 100, right? Or 200, say we could live that long. What is it that makes you the same over time? So it's a big, interesting philosophical question. We're not going to get into it here. That's a thing you can get into in metaphysics courses. I'm doing a philosophy and film course later this summer where we're going to be looking at that question for at least a little while, because it's a good question. It's a very interesting one. So there's this identity issue, and ultimately Williams wants to draw a line in the sand and say, look, it really has to be me who's living forever. Otherwise, well, one, it wouldn't be very appealing, right, if it turned out not to be me eventually. And two, really, if you think about it, to talk about living an immortal life, but one that fails the identity condition, it's not really an immortal life anymore, right? At some point, you've ceased to exist and there's some other person in your place if we're failing the identity condition. The second condition is the attractiveness condition. This is what Fischer calls it, as he puts it, the life of oneself in the future must be appealing. Now, Williams himself holds that you can't meet both of these conditions in an immortal life. So to meet the identity condition, we have to remain essentially static. That is, we have to be the same person. But if we're the same person forever, eventually that's going to fail the attractiveness condition, because we're going to get bored, right? It seems like, at least when Williams is dealing with a sort of less abstract and fanciful kind of existence, right? So he deals with certain cases that could meet the identity condition just hypothetically. He says, let's assume somehow we set the identity condition so that if your body continues existing forever, that's you, even if all your memories and experiences and desires and things like that change. So assuming we're really the same people and have basically the same sorts of desires and so on, Williams thinks eventually we're going to fail the attractiveness condition, because to really be us and for our immortal life in the future to be appealing to us now, it has to somehow fit in with the sorts of projects and categorical desires, as William calls them, our reasons for living now. We have to see that kind of continuity to really see the appeal of living forever. But of course, if you're engaged in the same sorts of projects and the same sorts of reasons for living forever, eventually you're just really going to get sick of it, right? You're going to get bored. So William says. Fischer wants to argue against that, and really he's going to deal with both of these conditions. So he deals with the identity condition a little bit. We'll look at that first, because that's what he does first. Then we're going to look at the attractiveness condition, and it's really the attractiveness condition that Fischer has more to say about, in part because it seems like that seems to be the largest stumbling block. Assuming we can have some kind of continuous existence, thinking about Williams' taxonomy of the 4 different kinds of immortal life we could have, the continuous existence, the one where we're just like we are, we just keep on going forever, that's sort of the most intuitive one that meets the identity condition, and that's the one that seems to most obviously fail the attractiveness condition in Williams' view. Okay, so first Fischer on the identity condition. So Williams argued that, and this was getting sort of near the end of the piece, that being permanently and fully engrossed in an activity would ultimately fail the identity condition. So remember his discussion in the end. He says, one way we could try to work around the fact we would ultimately get bored in what we're doing because we're consciously aware of the fact we'd be doing the same thing forever, is to have experience that would just be completely engrossing, the kind of experience where you lose yourself in it. And he gave, philosophical contemplation as a version of that, right? But it could be anything. Say you really love doing sports, and when you're engaged in sports, that's just it takes up your whole sort of mental capacity and your attention, and you're just fully present in the moment. That's just what you're doing, right? You're not sort of thinking about anything else or distracted by anything. You're just sort of living in the moment. You're fully engaged, fully engrossed. It could be anything: sport, dance, art, right? Philosophy, poetry. Could be games of a certain sort. It could be all sorts of different things. Now, Williams held that if you're permanently fully engrossed in an activity, ultimately you fail the identity condition precisely because it's no longer really you. If you've lost your conscious awareness that it's you who's doing what it is you're doing, then in some sense it really ceases to be you doing it, right? There's a phenomenon occurring, right? Somebody is dancing or engaging in sport or creating art or thinking or whatever it is, but it's not really you. It's no longer an identifiable person, given that they are just fully absorbed in that activity itself. Now, Fischer thinks this is just mistaken. And arguably, what Williams is trying to engage with there is a certain sort of philosophically nuanced account of this kind of engrossing activity that's coming out of Spinoza and being picked up by some other people, and so there's some background to this, and there are also religious versions of this as well that say, once you're released from your earthly body, or you shed your mortal coil, or however you want to phrase it, right? Once you've made the transition from the life as we now know it to some kind of beyond, you'll cease to be the individual person you were, right? You will continue to exist. You're not going to be you, right? If just taking me as an example again, somehow, in some sense, I'll continue to exist after I've died, my body's died, but I'll cease to really be Karl Lagerberg, right? There will be some kind of existence there, but it's not going to be the same sort of individual existence I now have. Now, Fischer says we need to pay attention to a distinction between the content of our experience and the ownership of that experience. So the ownership of the experience is really this question of whose experience is it, right? And we can think about, again, dance or sport or philosophy or art or whatever it might be. Now there's the content of the experience, right? Say being fully engaged in a game of basketball, or fully engaged in dance, or fully engaged in playing a game, or fully engaged in philosophy. And one thing I have to say, one thing I love about doing philosophy is how engrossing it is, at least for me. Right? I don't know if it is for you, but I find it very, very engrossing. And in fact, when I'm doing a lecture, or doing a talk of some sort, I find it utterly engrossing. Sometimes I just completely get lost in it, and I'm not really thinking about anything else. I'm not really distracted. All of my attention gets to go to this, which is lovely. Right? I find it lovely. Now, this distinction here that Fischer is drawing attention to, we can think about the content of our experiences, right? And that content, in fact, might be in some sense shared or quite similar. So think about playing a game, right, or some kind of sport with a bunch of other people. You're actually going to have very similar content to your experiences. Nobody's going to have exactly the same content because we're different people. We have different views on the world. We do different things. So even if you're all playing the same game, you have a different particular experience of the game. You're in different positions than other people. You play different roles and so on. If you were giving this lecture, you might be fully engrossed. You might wind up saying basically the same things I do. Even if you're not sort of self-consciously aware of the fact that it's you in particular who's doing it. I don't sit here going, Carl's now giving a lecture, right? Like, that's not running through my head. Rather, I'm just engrossed in what I'm doing, so I'm not really reflecting on myself. Now, we've got this distinction between content and ownership. Now, the experience I have of doing this, it has a particular content to it. Maybe you could have that content or very similar content if you were giving the lecture, but then it would really be your experience. This is the question of ownership. Whose experience is it really, right? Well, as subjects, we exist, we have experiences, we think about things and so on. And so even if we're fully engrossed by our experiences, right, we lose ourselves or we're absorbed in it and so on, they are still our experiences. What happens is that there's a certain feature of our experiences that gets lost, namely that we cease to be conscious of ourselves, right? We cease to be self-absorbed, as Fischer puts it at one point. At one point he puts it in other terms, we don't have to be narcissistically self-absorbed, constantly thinking about ourselves and that, oh, this is me doing this and so on. And it seems like Williams demands that our experience be that way for it to really be our experience. Now, he doesn't seem to quite come out and say this, though, Williams, that is. And so, Fischer offers this up and says, as long as we keep this distinction in mind, we can allow that very engrossing experiences can still be our experiences, right? So we can genuinely look towards a future that have these sorts of experience in them as really being our own future. So Williams' objection near the end that we really can't look to these fully absorbing or engrossing activities as constituting a desirable future for us, Fischer thinks is ultimately misguided and really just misses this distinction between content and ownership. All right, so that basically takes care of this one point Fischer wants to make about the identity condition that Williams was making. So Fischer is a little less interested in this piece in exploring different kinds of immortality than Williams was. And I think one just sort of background assumption that Fischer generally runs with throughout this piece is that he's really considering that continuous existence model, the basic default version of immortality that we can think of, where it's basically just you as you are going on and existing forever. So no sort of funny business about reincarnation or any of that other stuff that Williams was considering, right? The Tiresias model or the disjoint lives. It's really just the basic continuous existence that Fischer's really interested in. And of course, Williams offered up this one potential way around getting bored of being fully engrossed, being permanently fully engrossed in activity as a way of avoiding boredom, but ultimately that would be something that would fail the identity condition, he thought. Fischer says, I'm not really so sure, because even when somebody's fully engrossed in activity, we know it's still their activity, right? So even if somebody were permanently fully engrossed in something, it would still be them who was doing it. They just wouldn't be consciously aware of who they were anymore. But it doesn't immediately follow that they would cease to be who they were. Right? There's a distinction between how things are and what it is that we're actually aware of or believe or notice. Okay, so turning now to the attractiveness condition, right, the AC. Could we live an immortal life, being us, right, meeting the identity condition, but still find that immortal life attractive or desirable, that is, without getting bored or fed up or just exhausted or alienated from it? So Williams really presented two options, right? Either our characters and interests remain fixed, or over time they will change. So Fischer wants to look at really both of these, right? Whether or not we remain fixed or change over time. Williams thought in either case it's bad, right? We're going to have an undesirable immortal life. Fischer wants to say, actually, in either case, you can still have a desirable immortal life. So looking at Williams' case against someone with a fixed character, Fischer wants to point out three issues that come up there. So the first issue, right, Williams unreasonably demands, according to Fischer, that some single state or activity avoids boredom. Now, the way Fischer looks at the text and looks at the language Williams uses, and he says, based on that, it certainly sounds like Williams thinks it has to be some one thing that would just make boredom unthinkable. And of course, if that's how we look at it, then we immediately get to this question: does that mean it's fully engrossing? Are we permanently engaged in a fully engrossing activity? If so, then it seems like we cease to be us, Williams says. Fischer's already argued that wouldn't obviously follow. Now he wants to question this demand or perhaps assumption that we have to have a single state or activity to avoid boredom. But Fischer, and I think a good way of seeing Fischer's whole point in this article, is that we shouldn't have double standards for an immortal life versus a mortal life when we're thinking about what makes a life desirable or worth living. Now, Fischer just doesn't see a reason why an immortal life can't have some kind of package or mix of satisfying activities. Now, that's what we think a normal mortal life should have to be attractive, right, or desirable. We don't think in our normal mortal lives, unless you have some one thing you can always be doing, that it's necessarily boring or unattractive or alienating or not worth living or something like that. So Fischer thinks, when we look at the different sorts of activities and experiences that seem to make up a good human life, things that include, this is his list, including friendship, love, family, intellectual, artistic, and athletic activity, sensual delights, and so forth. Right? Think of all the different things that make life good. Now, as Fischer puts it, I've included this because I think he makes this point very clearly, very, very well here. He says, we can imagine that any one of these activities that we were just talking about, right? Friendship, love, family, intellectual, artistic, athletic pursuits, and so on. Any one of these activities would be boring and alienating, pursued relentlessly and without some combination of others. In general, single-minded and unbalanced pursuit of any single kind of activity will be unattractive. But of course, from the fact that one's life will be unending, it does not follow that it must be unitary or unbalanced. Now, I don't know about you, but I know for myself what Fischer's saying here certainly seems true based on my experience. Even when I take some of the things that I enjoy doing the most, if I do them without any sort of break and it's just constant, eventually they do lose their appeal. There's that old adage, variety is the spice of life. I certainly think there's something to that. I find I tend to be at my happiness. I find my life, it's most desirable and attractive when I can strike a very nice balance between things, where I can engage in a certain sort of activity for an hour or two and take a break and sort of switch gears and do something else. And I know when I've got free time, free days, weekends and things like this, I often strive to get some kind of balance in there. So it's not just one thing all day, but rather I get to do, I can do a bit of gardening, I can do a bit of reading, I can go for a nice walk, spend some time making food, right? I can engage in several different sorts of pleasurable activities, and the variation itself really makes them more pleasurable or desirable on the whole. If I were just doing one of those constantly, it would seem to lose its luster. And this is really Fischer's point here, right? Williams really he makes this demand or presents this condition that an immortal life has to have some single activity or state that avoids boredom, right? And it's just not clear why that would have to follow. Williams seems to suggest that, well, I'm going to pause on that. Let's move to the second point, because I think what I was about to say is going to fit in well with the rest of Fischer's criticisms here of Williams. So that's the first point. This should be second point. I'm going to take a second to fix that. All right, there we go, better. The second point. Williams unreasonably demands that boredom be made unthinkable, which would seem to involve something that is endlessly fascinating. Now, and this is really what I wanted to get into in the previous point. So, for an immortal life to be appealing, Williams says really what we have to ward off is boredom. Because for any sort of activity we can think of, if you engage in it too much, ultimately it can become boring, right? It can just lose its appeal over time. So we need something that's endlessly fascinating, something that we could never exhaust by pursuing or doing. Now, Fischer points out that endlessly fascinating might mean any of three different things, and that Williams just isn't quite clear about it. Whenever one turns to the activity, one finds it on balance fascinating. And as all things considered, it's fascinating. Right? Maybe not every little part of it, right? Maybe not every aspect of it. But as an activity, it's fascinating on the whole whenever we engage in it. Secondly, we might mean that whenever one turns to the activity, one finds it filled with fascinating moments, perhaps even densely packed with fascinating moments. Right? So we could find it on the whole fascinating. Right? Maybe sort of not all the parts of it, but at least on balance, it's fascinating. It can have fascinating moments, even if there's quite a bit of it that isn't so fascinating. Right? Or thirdly, and this seems to be the one that Williams really needs, so it seems to be the one he's almost assuming when he saw him endlessly fascinating, that something that's endlessly fascinating is something that if it were pursued forever, right, if it's some sort of activity or desire that we're trying to fulfill, if we tried to pursue it forever, we would find it at every moment fascinating. That there would be absolutely no parts of it that weren't fascinating. No parts of it that led to boredom or anything like that. Now, again, really, Fischer, the argument comes down to no double standards point. That's, if there's a nice, easy way to sum up Fischer's view, it's that we shouldn't have a double standard for an immortal life versus a mortal life. Right? In a nutshell, Williams's view is that any immortal life where we remain ourselves will necessarily lead to a boring existence, right? And boredom is not desirable. Fischer notes that we don't demand activities and projects and pursuits of sort C in our ordinary mortal lives for those lives to be desirable. Right? We don't think that for our ordinary mortal lives to be a good thing to have on the whole, that they need to involve experiences and projects and pursuits that are fascinating at every single moment. That is, if we're ever bored, that makes our existence not worth having. Right? And that seems to, in some ways, be a pretty obvious point. Right? We allow that there can be times of boredom, even pain and suffering and so on, in a valuable human life. But on the whole, they can still be worth living because of all the other good things that come with them. Now we can dispute about exactly where, if ever, that line comes that a life ceases to be worth living because it has boredom and pain and suffering and so on in it. Right? But I think there seems to be fairly widespread agreement that lives certainly can be desirable, worth living, and so on, even if they do have times of boredom and pain and suffering and so on. So here again, Williams really seems to be inserting a condition or a demand that's unreasonably high for immortal lives. So of course immortal lives don't meet the demand, right? They don't meet the condition. But the fact that they don't meet it isn't really a knock against immortal lives, rather it's a knock against the condition themselves. Right? If you have a condition that can never be met, it's not a very good condition. Right? If you're trying to measure things in a way that they can really never be measured, it's not a good way to measure it. Right? Our standards of measurement or our standards of evaluation should work in a certain sense for us. And so, if we're trying to distinguish between a life worth living and a life not worth living, if we have a standard that tells us every life is worth living or no lives are ever worth living, we might not have a good standard on our hands precisely because it's not discriminating in the right way. And I don't use the word discriminating here in that sense of discriminating based on race or sex or something like this, but to discriminate just right in neutral terms, if we take out the bad part of it, to discriminate is really a kind of distinguishing. Right? So we want our standards to be discriminatory in the sense that they accurately distinguish between things and do that in a way that's useful for our purposes. Having a standard here, if we're thinking about endlessly fascinating, we really mean version C, it's just not clear what would ever meet that standard. So it doesn't seem like a good standard to use. Okay. On to Fischer's third point about Williams on experience. Williams fails to distinguish between two kinds of pleasures: self-exhausting pleasures and repeatable pleasures. And this is where Fischer is going to make some more distinctions that are pretty important for ultimately the points he has in this piece. So self-exhausting pleasures, Fischer tells us, are the kind that are at least eventually not worth repeating. Right? And he says, you know, there can be even different subcategories of these. So they could be disappointing and complete in themselves pleasures. The ones that are disappointing, right, are ones that really weren't worth having in the first place. So they're, as Fischer explains, touted as being something really fascinating or worth doing, but once you've actually had the experience, you just don't really see what it's all about. So, right, you know, maybe it's eating at a particularly fancy restaurant or something. Everybody's talked it up, and you finally go and you do it, or you get a table or whatever, and you eat there, and you know, you finish the meal and sort of, I don't see what the fuss was about. Right? Why is everybody so worked up about this? Or, you know, movies or music. You'll probably get this thing at least some of the time as well. People really tout something as being, oh, absolutely fabulous, best movie, oh, it's wonderful, and then you watch it sort of, that was a pile of garbage, wasn't it? So there are the disappointing pleasures, right? These are self-exhausting because they're just not worth repeating. They really weren't worth having in the first place. There are also pleasures that are complete in themselves. Now, these ones are worth having, but they just aren't worth having again, or at least not worth having over and over and over. Fischer gives the example of saying, you know, say you've got a fear of heights, and you've been working, you've overcome that fear of heights, so you now set yourself a goal of climbing a mountain, precisely to show that you've overcome your fear. Now you go through it, and you climb the mountain, you do it. You know, you're happy that you did it, but you've got no desire to do it again. Right? You wanted to do it for the sake of being able to show yourself that you could. Now that it's done, you didn't really find the experience in and of itself pleasurable, so you don't want to do it anymore, but it was worth having at least once, right? Or say running a marathon, or trying to come first in a particular kind of competition, or whatever it might be. Right? Pleasures that are worth having at least once, perhaps even more than once, but they aren't worth doing over and over and over again. So that's the second version of self-exhausting pleasures. The other general category of pleasures are repeatable pleasures. These are worth having over and over again. And in fact, pursuing them, wanting to have them, themselves may form a stable categorical desire, one that might remain constant even over an immortal life. And so Fischer tells us, he says, certain salient sensual pleasures leap immediately to mind. The pleasures of sex, of eating fine meals and drinking fine wines, of listening to beautiful music, of seeing great art, and so forth. So we can think about those various sorts of pleasures, right, that we have, and they're immensely enjoyable. And it's not like once we've had them, we go, oh, okay, well, that's it. You know, I had my favorite meal. I guess it's time to kill myself, right? Because there's no point in ever doing it again. Now, of course, Fischer admits that, again, a life that is devoted single-mindedly to pursuing some of these sorts of pleasures, right? Having your favorite meal, every single meal, that would, in fact, become undesirable, probably fairly quickly. So having some kind of unitary or unbalanced, you know, a life that's unhealthily fixated on doing one particular thing at the expense of all other things, he says, of course, that does seem like it wouldn't really be appealing. So thinking about those endlessly fascinating activities he was just talking about in the previous slide, Fischer says, you know, an immortal life, to be appealing, doesn't have to have any of those activities, really, right? We don't have to have anything that's really endlessly fascinating. But if we have some group or set of activities that we can engage in a healthy, balanced, mixed fashion, that itself seems to make for an appealing and desirable mortal life. So it's just unclear why those wouldn't constitute the grounds on which an immortal life could be desirable as well, right? if we think about these different sorts of repeatable pleasures and our desire to have them, that could form a stable categorical desire over time, right? When I think of my favorite foods, of course, if I ate them for every meal of the day, I could see I'd quickly get sick of them. But, you know, after some years of eating the things that I still love to eat, it's not that I've gotten sick of them just because I've had them many times before, right? What seems much more salient is whether or not I've had them recently. I'm thinking about a meal that I really enjoy and I haven't had recently often makes my desire for it grow, right? But the fact that I've been having it for 10 or 20 or 30 years, in and of itself, doesn't make the prospect of having it again unappealing to me. Right? Now, of course, there's always the possibility of finding new and interesting experiences, and presumably, Fischer doesn't quite get into this one, over the course of an immortal life, you would exhaust all possibilities. Right? You could eventually eat every possible dish that could be made. Presumably, there's some finite combination of ingredients and cooking times and so on. So there are a finite number of dishes. That said, there are still a lot of dishes. Right? There are many, many, many different kinds of dishes we can eat. And so when you think about, sure, maybe you can't have new dishes forever, eventually run out. You can have them, you know, a limited number of dishes in a varied cycle. And in fact, you can mix the cycle up. And of course, even in that, there's only so many permutations you can have. We're just thinking mathematically, if you have a limited number of dishes, and we think about different ways of arranging them, right, in the course of a week or month or year, or whatever it is, the order in which you have them. I'm going to have this dish once on this day, and then the next day I want to have this other dish, and then I want to go back to the first one, and I want to do something else. And, right, there are a limited number of permutations. But the number of permutations of the dishes we can have and the order we have them in itself is so vast. At least my guess is that over time we would still find falling into some of those patterns we've been in before itself desirable, precisely because it's been so long since we were in them in the first place. Think about, again, and Fischer talks about environments a little bit. He talks about being in, you know, California and being in San Francisco and so on. But you can think about places you love to go. It's like going into the Rocky Mountains. I quite enjoy being in the Rockies. I also enjoy being other places. And of course, you can go back to a place you've been years before, and in some sense, there's something quite refreshing about that. Right? There's something interesting about varying where you're going. And revisiting places that it's been quite some time you've been in. So it's really this question of variation, right? It certainly seems like we have repeatable pleasures that don't exhaust themselves. And even if we had an immortal life, it's certainly not clear that these repeatable pleasures would eventually become exhausted. Right? It seems quite plausible, Fischer thinks, that even over the course of an immortal life, certainly some of our pleasures would remain sort of infinitely repeatable. Right? Certainly not right all in a row. We don't want to sort of have an unhealthy, imbalanced immortal life. You're always doing one thing. But if you've got a range of repeatable pleasures and you can vary between them, it's not obvious why an immortal life would cease to be interesting, why it would automatically get boring. Right? That only seems to be the case if all of our pleasures are self-exhausting. One other quick comment on this, and I won't go all the way into it. When Fischer's talking about repeatable pleasures, he also gives the story of Andre and his goose livers, which is a lovely little story. I'm not going to say any more about it, but it's certainly worth reading the piece, even just to see that. Okay. So, Williams really sets the bar too high for the experiences that would make for a desirable immortal life. He fails to pay careful attention and distinguish between different sorts of pleasures. And once we recognize that there are these different sorts of pleasures, right, repeatable pleasures being the ones that are going to help us have an appealing immortal life, and we realize that we can't set the standards for an appealing immortal life too high, Fischer thinks that Williams' conclusion that necessarily an immortal life is going to lead to boredom ultimately isn't really supported. Now, there's I'm sorry. I want to back up just for a second. There's one other note that Fischer makes here, which I was talking about this a little bit when we were talking about Williams last time. There's a little bit of a discussion of Kierkegaard, and we've seen Kierkegaard come up in Quinn, and I think he's been mentioned a little bit elsewhere as well. Fischer talks just a little bit about Kierkegaard trying to show how hedonistic earthly pleasures ultimately aren't really worth it, and tries to point the reader to religious or spiritual experiences or pleasures as being repeatable and really worth having. Fischer says this at one point. He says, surely the deep and resonant rewards of spiritual and religious experience would not somehow become wooden or etoliated if part of an endless life, right? So going back and thinking about, if we think about Tolstoy or Craig or perhaps Quinn, really any view of the afterlife, right? Or really some version of personal immortality that involves something like heaven or some other place where we continue to exist. For that to be appealing, presumably there have to be certain sorts of experiences there that themselves will be pleasurable, perhaps absorbing. We could think and talk about them in more particular ways, but presumably immortal existence won't be appealing if it's just ultimately boring or uninteresting or something like that. So presumably there has to be something attractive, appealing, desirable about the kinds of experiences we're going to have, right? So if we think of immortality in heaven or something like that, there's a real question of what are you going to do in heaven? Right? And I don't think that's just sort of an amusing question. If we think going to heaven is an appealing prospect, then we presumably need to have some sense of what would make it appealing. Presumably certain sorts of desirable experiences, that is, certain sorts of pleasurable experiences. Perhaps pleasure even seems to be a little underwhelming as a term, because we can think about awe-inspiring and truly absorbing activities and so on, right? Contemplating the glory of God, or, right? How do you feel in heaven? That seems like a very salient question, and it seems like there have to be repeatable pleasures to make that kind of existence in that kind of place itself something worth having. So this is just a little note that Fischer sticks in here, and I think it's worth bringing up again precisely because some of these notions came up elsewhere. Okay. So last point here. So remember earlier, you said Fischer's going to deal with two different scenarios, one in which we're essentially the same over time. We have the same basic desires and we want the same sorts of things. We're basically the same kinds of people. And of course, that's the situation Williams is, in a sense, really most interested in, because that's the situation where clearly our identity is the same. We meet the identity condition. But what about if we change over time? And of course, Williams says, well, if you change in certain sorts of ways, you're no longer going to be you. You don't meet the identity conditions. I don't want that. Fischer engages with this a little bit more. Now, just think about Williams a second more. Williams holds that an individual may not find their future life attractive if there isn't the appropriate relationship between an individual's current character and future goals, values, and interests. Right? If we change too much, we won't now have a desire for a future life where we become a radically different person. So that immortal life won't be desirable or attractive. It's not going to be conditioned to the attractiveness condition to us now, if in fact, over the course of that immortal life, we're going to change so much that we cease to be the people we already are. But Fischer replies that in fact, we might welcome potentially radical changes in our characters if it would result from certain sorts of sequences. Now, what does Fischer mean by that? Well, look, in our ordinary mortal life, our character, values, and desires change, right? For example, we desire to live and work in a certain place and in a certain way, at least for a part of our life. Fischer gives the example of, living in a metropolitan urban area, right? So you live in Calgary, New York, or Toronto, or Vancouver, or something, right? And it's exciting, and there's a lot going on, and maybe you really like that. You like that environment. But in a different part of your life, say later in life, when you go to retire or something like that, you desire a change of scenery and pace, right? You want a quieter place. You want a less densely packed place. You want a safer place. You want a place that has greater access to nature or whatever it might be, right? We don't normally prefer death to such changes. Another example he gives is, say, somebody who has a change in political views. Say somebody is a committed, pick whatever you want, right? It might be liberal or conservative or whatever, right? Say they're very committed, and then at a future time in their lives, they themselves go through a change in their attitudes and beliefs and so on, and they actually switch their views, right? They switch their beliefs. They cease to be the sort of person they were before. Now, generally speaking, we don't prefer to be dead than to change in those sorts of ways, Fischer says, right? In fact, sometimes we welcome certain sorts of changes. And in fact, and I think this is something we can add a little bit to Fischer. I think certainly when we look at our lives, at least from, in our younger stages, right? From the time we're born to the time we're at least, say, 20-ish. I'm just sort of picking that number there. During that time, we fully expect to change a fair bit, right? Maybe as a child, as you're growing up, perhaps you don't fully expect to change. But I certainly think, up to the age of sort of at least 20, if not longer. So I'm not just trying to be ageist here. As we change and we look back at our earlier selves and we see that we've changed, we don't somehow regret it or begrudge it or think that there's something terrible that's happened here. We just recognize this is naturally part of what it is to be a human over time. Right? We grow, we develop, our tastes change, and so on. And I don't see a particular reason to think that our character needs to remain ultimately static and fixed over the course of our life. Further change itself isn't obviously something undesirable, at least from what I can see. So as long as our character, right, who we are, our identity in some sense, changes in some kind of sensible, gradual way, right? One that's sort of maybe not even necessarily expected, but one that doesn't involve some kind of sudden, inexplicable break from our past, then we can find these sorts of changes attractive and desirable. And of course, if we think about this kind of situation Nagel was talking about, you suffer a sudden head injury, right? You lose a lot of your mental capacity or something like that, right? Due to an accident, you lose all your previous memories. That sort of change we certainly might regard as something unfortunate and undesirable, right? Something that would be better not to happen. But if we see change occurring in the usual ordinary way, in this somewhat organic, almost sensible way, which is not to say entirely foreseeable way, it's certainly not obvious to me or Fischer why that in and of itself is obviously unattractive. Now, I'm not trying to bias you here and throw all my chips in with Fischer. I'm just saying that at least on this point, it seems like he is tapping into something that's fairly intuitive for us, which isn't necessarily to say that Williams doesn't have something that goes beyond this or something to counter this point. So I'll just close here with another remark from Fischer on this last point. He says, all that is required to defend the thesis that immortality is not necessarily unattractive is that there be certain changes of character plausibly envisaged as part of an immortal life, which would not be so unattractive as to render death preferable. So just saying that again in slightly different words, all that we need to allow for to see an immortal life as at least possibly worth living is that there can be certain changes of character that occur over time that aren't so bad that they would make being dead preferable than going through those character changes. Given that I myself have changed throughout the course of my life, my beliefs, attitudes, right, sort of general leanings and so on, I'd say a fair amount of my character has changed one way or another over time. And I think many people's character do, at least to some degree. I certainly don't think it would be preferable for me to be dead than to be the person I am now versus, say, the person I was 15 or 25 years ago. In the same way, looking ahead, if I look 30 years into the future, if I'm quite a different person 30 years from now, I highly doubt that I'll think, especially then, that it's worth being dead. If I hadn't that'd be better for me to be dead than to have changed from who I am now. Right? That desire for such a static character, such a static existence, again seems like a kind of unreasonable demand that Williams is putting in here, adding a kind of double standard for an immortal life to be attractive versus a mortal life to be attractive, as Fischer is ultimately saying. So we'll go ahead and close there. I suppose just a closing thought on all of this. Ultimately, as I've said a few times here, Fischer's view boils down to the no double standards point. Right? If an immortal life can be attractive, it can be attractive under the same sorts of conditions that a mortal life can. Now, maybe he is really missing something, because Williams is trying to draw attention to the fact that given an immortal life, knowing that it's just going to go on and on forever, certain projects, activities, really, Williams ultimately wants to say all of them, will seem to lose their luster. It doesn't seem like our interest can stand up for an infinite amount of time in doing anything in particular if we remain the sorts of people we are. So there's these two conditions, that identity condition, the attractiveness condition. Williams says you can't meet both of them at the same time. Fischer objects to the conditions, at least to some degree, saying, look, no, you can't have a double standard here for an immortal life versus immortal life. And it at least seems possible, though not guaranteed, that an immortal life, much the same as our current mortal life here, could be desirable if it has the right kind of mixture of repeatable pleasures that would make our normal mortal life appealing now. It just wouldn't have any kind of end to it. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. I'll leave it up to you to think about these two and whether or not Fischer or Williams has presented a better case. Maybe they're forgetting something, right? It's quite possible you've got some other idea you can add to this discussion and say, well, look, they're actually forgetting about something here, or there's something more to be said on one of the particular points, or maybe there's just a different point entirely. You might also be able to draw attention to some examples or say something else to help make clear what their position probably is and why you think it's a good position or not. All right, we'll go ahead and end this video here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next week when we get into our next topic. Until then, have a great weekend, and I'll see you later. Bye for now.